Hi, my name is Alana Agron. I'm an undergraduate at Duke University, and my research presentation is entitled Racial Disproportionality in North Carolina, an analysis of identification practices for special education and gifted programs. So I was interested in the topic of racial disproportionality, which refers to the national trend of Black and Brown students being over-identified for special education programs and under-identified for gifted programs. And this trend is also documented here in the state of North Carolina. This leads to these students being disciplined at higher rates than their peers. They're placed in more restrictive educational environments and experience worse academic, occupational, and socioeconomic outcomes. There's a lot of hypotheses about what goes into racial disproportionality, but identification of students with disabilities and gifted talent is the first step in the process. Therefore, these identification practices should be investigated as a means for reducing racial disproportionality. Universal screeners are identification method shown to reduce bias and are required in North Carolina, but districts and schools have agency in how they implement them. But schools may also use individual referrals from teachers and parents to identify students, and these referrals are associated with less equitable outcomes. This exploratory study aimed to assess differences in how North Carolina schools identify students for special education services and gifted programs, measure educator perceptions of disproportionality, and uncover best practices to mitigate racial disproportionality. So I conducted in-depth interviews with 20 educators from 17 North Carolina public elementary schools. Interview questions were separated into 5 categories: demographic information of the educator, special education identification, gifted identification, best practices, and educator perspectives. So my results indicated that there's substantial variation in how schools identify students. Half of the schools primarily relied on referrals instead of universal screeners, and this was surprising to me. And educators indicated this is actually a change since the pandemic begun. They said there's a decline in confidence in the efficacy of universal screeners because of the pandemic. Just because of how much school was missed, there's this lower overall achievement on these exams and all these screeners. So it's hard to tell if a child truly need special education services or if they possess gifted traits. Most of the schools did not screen for social and emotional issues. Also surprising was that most educators do believe disproportionality is a problem at large, but not at their schools. However, many of these educators indicated that it was because they felt the practices that they recommended to me and that their schools implemented were really working in their favor. So best practices for mitigating racial disproportionality really emphasize combining universal screeners with other bias reducing practices, such as hiring a representative teaching staff and racial bias training. Many times, just cultural differences in students are seen to be deficiencies. So if you have teachers that truly understand the needs and talents of their students, then this can help mitigate this phenomenon. Also providing multiple pathways for entry. This is particularly related to having multiple pathways for underrepresented students to be identified for gifted, such as having portfolios of student works or enrichment programs to really develop gifted skills. And they also stress having parent engagement. If parents have the knowledge and resources and feel comfortable advocating for their students, for their children, then they can help if their children are slipping through the cracks in the system to help mitigate them from falling victim to this. There are several limitations to my study, the first being a possible non-response bias. I reached out to hundreds of schools and only interviewed 20, so I may not have the most representative sample just based on who responded. Because I did qualitative research, I can't determine the efficacy of any of the recommendations that were given to me, and I also can't draw any statistical conclusions. But future research on this topic can conduct more interview to draw statistical conclusions and also to evaluate the efficacy of these recommendations. They can also interview educators from different states to see if there's any other practices that are recommended. And just generally, schools should aim to include multiple pathways for entry, not just rely on universal screeners or referrals. Thank you so much. There was a typo, but I don't want to refilm.
It's okay.
Wait, how bad do you think this is? Wait, I'm still recording.
It's okay.
I'm still recording. I'm still recording.